Adjunct Professor Moran, Microeconomics 112. In this session, we're going to introduce the concept of monopsony, a condition where there's only a single employer hiring workers. So far, we've discussed wage determination in a purely competitive industry where there's an unlimited number of workers and an unlimited number of firms hiring. Many firms compete to hire workers, many workers compete for jobs, all with identical skills. Firms and workers are wage takers. Neither one is available to influence the market by withholding more or less. The market demand is the sum of the individual demand curves for the firm, which, if you recall, the individual demand curve for the firm is the marginal revenue product, downward sloping. The supply is upward sloping for the industry, because in order to attract more workers, a higher wage will be required to induce workers to leave other industries or to induce people not in the labor force to join the labor force. So the supply is a positive relationship between wages and the quantity of inputs hired. Lower wage, workers will stay in other industries or not be in the labor force. Higher wages will induce workers to leave other industries and people on the sidelines to join the labor force. So here's our positive relationship with supply. Here's our demand for labor, which equals the marginal revenue product. There are 200 firms, each firm supplying, say, 5 units. That would provide an equilibrium in the market of 1,000. Number of firms times the amount hired by each firm equals the quantity in the industry. This wage rate that prevails in the industry is taken by the individual firm. Because the individual firm is assumed to be so small compared to the overall market, it can hire as many workers as it wants at the prevailing wage rate. You'll find the individual demand curve, the marginal revenue product, which we've calculated in prior sessions, equal to the supply. This will be the quantity hired by the firm and the wage rate. That's a review. A monopsonist is when there's a single employer buying a substantial quantity of the labor available. A single buyer of a type of labor. Now to make this happen, labor has to be immobile. So, for example, the monopsonist might be hiring in a particular city, and there's only so many of that type of labor in the city, and they're not available to commute from other labor markets. The firm is a wage maker. The wage paid varies directly as the quantity hired. The individual firm isn't perfectly elastic. The individual firm actually sees the supply curve in the industry. So instead of the firm having a perfectly elastic supply curve, as a perfectly competitive industry does, the monopolist sees the positive relationship between wage and quantity hired. That means to hire more workers, the individual firm can't hire as many as it wants at the current wage rate. It has to pay more. And that's going to cause a split between the marginal resource cost and the supply curve, which is where we're going to read the wage from. If you remember, in a purely competitive industry, when we talked about types of competition, the pure competitor, when he was selling output, we're talking about input here, when he's selling output, had a perfectly elastic price, and it was taken from the market. But a monopoly has to charge a monopoly. In order to sell more, the monopolist had to lower its price in order to sell more, because demand is a negative relationship. And that caused a split between demand and marginal revenue for the monopoly. Well, this is quantity of output, and this is price. We're now talking about wages and quantity of input. So this curve, which hopefully you understood from types of competition, is inverted because it's not revenue or price, it's cost. And so what you're going to have is a split between demand, as we had a split between supply, as we had a split between demand, and marginal resource cost. Here it was marginal revenue, here it's marginal resource cost. So it's the same concept, if you can get your head around that. So that means in order to hire more workers, the firm is going to have to pay a higher wage rate. But you can't pay just the higher wage rate to the last worker hired, because all the other workers who are hired at lower wage rates would have morale problems. So in order to hire that worker at a higher wage rate, the monopsonist has to increase the wage rate for all prior workers. And that's what's going to cause this split between marginal resource cost and the wage rate, which is read from the supply line. Okay, so let's explain that. Why this split happens between the wage rate, which is the supply curve, and the additional cost of hiring a worker, the marginal resource cost. So at any quantity of labor, the wage rate will be here, but the marginal resource cost will be higher. There'll be a split. They won't be equal. And this is why. Let's actually calculate the marginal resource cost. So to do that, we have got 1 through 6 workers, and the wage rate is $10 for each worker. What's the total labor bill? Oh, that's the pure monopolist. That's the purely competitive firm where he gets the $10. He's paying the same wage rate to everybody, $10. And so if he hires 2 workers, he's got 23, he's got 30. What's the marginal resource cost? 10. That explains the perfectly elastic supply curve for the individual firm in a purely competitive market. But now let's look at a monopsonist. There's going to be a split between the supply curve, which is where we're reading the wage from, and how much extra it costs that firm to hire that extra worker at maybe a higher wage rate. And it's going to cause a split between marginal resource cost and the wage rate supply curve. So here we have 1 through 6 workers, and the wage rate, in order to hire more workers, the monopsonist, because he sees the supply curve of the industry, since he's the only one hiring, has to charge a higher wage rate, has to pay a higher wage rate to induce additional workers. So at 1 worker, the wage rate of $6 gives us a total labor bill of $6. 2 workers, he increases the wage rate to $7 and has a total labor bill of $14. 3 workers, $8 wage, $24. 4 workers, $9, $36 total labor cost. 5 and 10 is 50, 6 and 11 is 66. Notice the supply curve is a positive relationship between wage and number of workers hired. Supply, a positive relationship. Now let's calculate his marginal resource cost. And what we're going to see is that at any wage rate, the marginal resource cost is going to be higher. So at any number of workers, you're going to bump into the supply curve first, then the marginal resource cost curve. Okay. So at 1 worker, the total wage cost is 6. That's a marginal resource cost. Marginal extra resource cost of hiring additional workers, 6. The total labor cost at 2 workers is 14, which is marginal resource cost of 8. At 3 workers, the wage rate rises to 8. Total labor cost is 24. The marginal resource cost is 10. At 9 workers, the total labor cost rises to 36. 36 minus 24 gives us a marginal resource cost of 12. To go from 4 workers to 5 workers, the wage rate goes from 9 to 10. The total labor bill goes from 36 to 50. That gives us a marginal resource cost of 14. And to go to 6 workers, the wage rate has to rise to 11. Total labor cost of 66. 66 minus 50 gives us a marginal resource cost of 16. Now, why is this happening? To hire the first worker, so really these curves should be like this. Marginal resource cost and supply start are equal only at the first one. Much like when we had types of business competition, the demand curve and the marginal revenue was the same at the first unit of output. That'll be the same here. So at 6, it's an additional $6. But to hire the second worker at $7, you have a marginal resource cost of 7 for that worker, but you have to pay the guy who originally got paid 6 an extra $1. That means the marginal resource cost will be 8. The additional for the first worker and the amount to catch the first worker up. That's $8. Now they're both at a wage rate of $7. To hire the third worker, the wage rate is $8. Your marginal resource cost has to include that $8 for the extra worker and an extra $1 to keep the original guy that was paid 7 up, and an additional $1 to pay the guy that was originally paid 6 up to 8. That gives you a marginal resource cost of 10, and your wage rate is only 8. Marginal resource cost is greater than wage. At a wage rate of 9, that's an additional marginal resource cost for that worker. but you've got to pay the guy that was originally paid $8 an extra $1 to catch him up. And the guy that was paid $7, we did his adjustment before, but now we got to adjust him again to get him to $9, $7, got to catch him up, and the $6 guy would catch him up. That's 9 and 3, giving us a total of 4 workers, and a marginal resource cost of 12. When we get to 10, you have to pay that guy 10. That's an additional resource cost to the firm of 10. And the $9 guy, we have to catch him up by paying him an additional 1. The $8 guy, we adjusted him last time to catch him up to 9. We got to pay him an additional 1. The $7 guy, we adjusted him a couple times. We got to get him to 9. We got to pay him an additional 1. And the $6 guy, we adjusted a couple times to catch up to 9. We got to pay him an additional 1. And that's where the 14 comes from. 10 for the new guy, and 4 additional for the other 4 workers, resulting in a marginal resource cost of 14. So here it is graphically. These should be equal at 6 at 1, $6 at 1 unit of input. When we go to the second, the wage rate is 7, but the marginal resource cost is 8. At 3 workers, the wage rate is 8, but the marginal resource is 10. At 4 workers, the wage rate is 9, but the marginal resource cost is 12. So at any level of quantity of input, there will be a split between the wage rate, read from the supply curve, and the marginal resource cost. Okay. In our next video, we're actually going to find how the firm, the monopsonist, determines the quantity of workers and the wage rate that will prevail in the market.